The scraping sound came first, frantic, deliberate, wrong for 3 in the morning. Thomas Walker jolted awake, heart hammering against his ribs. Max never dug like that, not in 10 years. He grabbed the flashlight, boots unlaced, and stumbled into the New Mexico cold. The beam found his German shepherd tearing at the dirt beneath the old storage shed, claws bloody, breath coming in desperate huffs. Max, stop! The dog ignored him, kept digging. Thomas knelt, pulled him back, and froze. Not a termite mound, a corner of leather, dark with age and earth. He scraped away 50 years of burial, with shaking hands until the valley emerged cracked, stained, impossibly familiar. The name stamped in faded gold made his throat close. William T. Walker, 1908. His own last name. A year he'd been 17. Inside, 2 birth certificates. Same date, same hospital, same parents. 2 sons. Thomas had always been told he was an only child. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. Thomas Walker lived alone in a way that made silence feel like a third presence in the house. The 50-acre ranch sprawled across New Mexico scrubland, all dust and distance. The kind of land that asked nothing and gave less. He'd bought it 15 years ago, with his veteran's pension and Sarah's life insurance, back when he still believed starting over meant something. His wife Margaret kept to her side of the house now. They'd been married 15 years, but the warmth had leaked out somewhere around year 3. She wanted the city, her sister's guest room in Phoenix. Anything but this. His sons called twice a year if he was lucky. Brad practiced law in Boston and measured everything in billable hours, including his father's worth. Michael worked as an engineer in Denver, always one meeting away from being too busy. The family photo on the wall showed 4 people, but Thomas could never shake the feeling someone was missing from the frame. Max was all he had left that mattered. The German shepherd had come from the shelter a decade ago, already full-grown, already carrying some story in his eyes that Thomas recognized. They understood each other. Max slept at the foot of his bed, followed him through morning chores, sat beside him through dinner, eaten alone at the kitchen table while Margaret watched television in the other room. The ranch made $1,800 a month in pension payments, sometimes another few hundred selling vegetables at the weekend market, enough to get by, not enough to feel secure. Thomas had grown up poor in Montana, the kind of poor where winter meant choosing between heat and food. His parents, James and Ruth Walker, had worked themselves into early graves. His father's heart gave out when Thomas was 22. His mother followed with depression that had turned her into a ghost long before the funeral. They'd never talked about family, never mentioned siblings or cousins or anyone beyond their small, closed circle. He'd married Sarah in the 70s, had 2 boys, built something that felt like happiness. Then cancer took her in 2 brutal years, and Thomas learned that grief doesn't fade. It just becomes furniture you arrange your life around. He'd remarried too soon to Margaret, seeking comfort and finding only cohabitation. Some nights he dreamed of a boy who looked exactly like him. Same eyes, same mouth, same hands. The boy would be crying, reaching for him across some vast distance Thomas could never cross. He'd wake with his chest tight, chalking it up to old age and regret. His mother had left a letter when she died, sealed, marked for Thomas's eyes only. He'd never opened it, Fear was a funny thing. It could keep an envelope sealed for decades, could convince you some truths were better left buried, until Max started digging, until a name surfaced that should have been impossible. William. Thomas carried the valise inside with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Max followed, pressing against his leg like he knew something momentous had shifted in the world. The leather was cracked and water-stained, the latches corroded green. It took him 20 minutes and a screwdriver to pry it open. The birth certificates lay on top, yellowed but legible. Thomas Timothy Walker and William Theodore Walker, born the same day at the same hospital to James and Ruth Walker. Twins? The word felt foreign in his mouth, impossible as a second moon. He'd been told his whole life he was an only child, had built his identity around being the sole focus of his parents' struggling love. Beneath the certificates, a photograph stopped his breath. 2 infants, identical, wrapped in hospital blankets, their tiny fists curled against their cheeks. Someone had written on the back in his mother's handwriting, "Our boy's 3 months old." A military ID card came next. Plastic cracked with age. William Theodore Walker. Service number worn, but visible. United States Marine Corps. The photo showed a young man with Thomas's face, Thomas's eyes, wearing a uniform Thomas had never worn because he'd stayed home to care for aging parents during the war years. Half a playing card, the Joker, torn roughly down the middle, dried blood darkened one edge. Thomas stared at it, then stood abruptly and walked to his bedroom, pulled out the old cigar box he kept in his closet. Inside, among his father's pocket watch and Sarah's wedding ring, lay the other half. He'd carried it since childhood, never knowing why, never questioning the compulsion to keep it. The edges matched perfectly. A letter addressed to Tommy, in handwriting he didn't recognize, lay at the bottom of the valise. The envelope had never been opened, the seal still intact, despite decades of burial. And finally, a hand-drawn map with a single location circled in Albuquerque. Thomas called Brad first. His son answered on the 5th ring, irritation clear in his voice. "Dad, it's after midnight here. I found something. Documents. I think I had a twin brother." Silence, then a sigh. "You found some old paperwork, and now you're inventing conspiracy theories, Dad. You're 70 years old. Let it go." Michael was gentler, but equally dismissive. Maybe it was a mistake at the hospital. These things happened back then. Don't get worked up about it. Margaret stood in the doorway when he hung up, arms crossed. "What are you doing finding out who I am? You're 70 years old. Thomas, you're whoever you've been for 7 decades. Why dig up the past now? Because it's been buried long enough." She shook her head and went back to bed. Max stayed, watching Thomas with those knowing eyes. The letter from his mother waited in the drawer where he'd kept it since her funeral. He'd been afraid for 36 years. Now he opened it. The words unraveled everything. His mother's confession poured across 3 pages of cramped handwriting. The poverty, the impossible choice. Sending William away as an infant to relatives who returned him years later, covered in bruises. The favoritism that Thomas had never noticed because he'd been the favored one. William's enlistment at 18, desperate to escape. His return, broken from war. The decision his father made to commit William to a psychiatric facility and erase him from the family record, giving him a new name so they could forget. We called him John Miller. His mother had written, so we could pretend William never existed, so we could pretend we hadn't failed him. Thomas, you were always the strong one. William was always the one who needed us. And we couldn't bear it. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Thomas read until the words blurred. Max pressed his head against Thomas's knee, solid and warm and real in a world that had suddenly become strange as a fever dream. Thomas hired a private investigator with $500 he'd been saving for truck repairs. The man was thorough and discreet, asking few questions Thomas couldn't answer. 2 weeks later, an email arrived with an attachment, a single-page report, and a grainy photograph that made Thomas's chest tighten. John Miller, age 70, residing at Silver Horizons Nursing Home in Albuquerque, Medicaid recipient, no known family, advanced Alzheimer's disease, stage 7. The photograph showed a man in a wheelchair, gaunt and white-haired, staring at nothing through a window streaked with rain. Thomas looked at his own reflection in the computer screen and saw the same face 20 pounds heavier, same bone structure, same distant expression he wore when he thought no one was watching. The 3-hour drive to Albuquerque stretched like purgatory. Margaret had refused to come, told him he was chasing ghosts. Max rode in the passenger seat, alert and tense, picking up on Thomas's nervous energy. Silver Horizon sat on the edge of the city, a low-slung building the color of desert sand. Inside smelled like industrial cleaner and boiled vegetables and something else Thomas couldn't name, maybe resignation. The nurse at the front desk looked up with practiced sympathy when he explained who he was looking for. Room 12. But I should warn you, Mr. Walker, John doesn't recognize anyone anymore. He hasn't spoken in months. The hallway seemed to narrow with each step. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs hard enough to hurt. Max pulled at the leash, eager, sensing something Thomas couldn't articulate. William sat by the window in his wheelchair, exactly as he'd appeared in the photograph. Thin to the point of frailty, hands trembling slightly in his lap, eyes focused on something far beyond the parking lot and scrubland visible through the glass. He wore a cardigan someone had buttoned wrong and slippers that had seen better decades. Thomas approached slowly, throat tight. William, no response, not even a flicker of recognition. William, I think I'm your brother, your twin brother, Truk. The man in the wheelchair continued staring at nothing, breath steady and shallow, present in body but absent in every way that mattered. Max whined low in his throat, then pulled forward. Thomas let the leash go slack. The German shepherd walked to William's side and gently nuzzled his hand. For the first time, William moved. His trembling fingers touched Max's head, and some ghost of awareness passed across his face. The corners of his mouth lifted in the barest suggestion of a smile. The nurse appeared in the doorway. Animals usually upset the residents, but John's always been different with dogs. It's the only time he responds to anything. Thomas knelt beside his brother. The word still felt impossible, and watched Max rest his chin on William's knee. Tears burned behind his eyes. 70 years, this man had been alive, and Thomas had never known. I'm taking him home, Thomas said. The nurse's expression shifted to concern. Mr. Walker, the level of care John requires is extensive. Full-time supervision, medications, specialized equipment. The cost runs between $6,000 and $8,000 monthly. And I'm sorry to say this, but the doctors estimate he has less than a year. There's lung cancer, advanced stage. He's been declining rapidly. He's my brother. I understand, but he's been alone for 50 years because our family was too weak to keep him. I have maybe 12 months to change that. Thomas stood, decision crystallizing into certainty. Tell me what paperwork I need to sign. That evening, he called Brad to explain the situation. His son's voice went cold and sharp the way it did in courtrooms. You're going to bankrupt yourself for a stranger who doesn't even know you exist. He's not a stranger. He's your uncle. He's a diagnosis and a bank account drain, Dad. Think about this rationally. You have maybe $20,000 in savings. That buys you 3 months of care before you're selling the ranch. Then what? You lose everything for someone who won't even remember the sacrifice. This isn't about memory. It's about being the person I should have been 70 years ago. And what about your actual family, your sons? Are we supposed to watch you throw away any inheritance, any security, any future because you found some documents in the dirt? Thomas gripped the phone hard enough to hurt. That money was never yours. This life was never yours. I'm 70 years old, and I just found out I've been living half a life. The time I have left belongs to William. Brad hung up without saying goodbye. Michael called an hour later, voice heavy with exhaustion and something that might have been understanding. Dad, I get it, I do. But Brad's not wrong about the money. I know. You're really going to do this? Thomas looked at Max, who sat watching him with steady, knowing eyes. I already did. Thomas converted the living room into a makeshift hospital ward over 3 exhausting days. He sold his truck to a neighbor for $4,000 cash, used half for a hospital bed and oxygen equipment, the rest for medications and supplies. The remaining furniture went to the garage. Margaret watched from the kitchen doorway, saying nothing, her silence louder than any argument. William came home on a Tuesday morning in an ambulance Thomas couldn't afford, but paid for anyway. The paramedics transferred him to the bed with professional efficiency, checked the oxygen levels, gave Thomas a crash course in feeding tubes and catheter care, then left him alone with a 3-ring binder full of instructions and a brother who didn't know his name. Max claimed the space beside William's bed immediately, settling onto the floor with a heavy sigh, like he'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. He didn't leave, except to go outside twice a day. And even then, reluctantly. The first week nearly broke Thomas. He learned to change bedding with a patient still in it, to measure medications, to watch for bed sores, and adjust pillows every 2 hours through the night. His back ached constantly. He dropped a glass at 3 in the morning and cut his hand cleaning it up, blood mixing with tears he hadn't meant to shed. Margaret moved her belongings into the guest bedroom without discussion, but there were moments, small, inexplicable moments, when something passed between them. Thomas would be reading aloud from an old Western novel, his voice hoarse from exhaustion, and William's fingers would twitch. Or he'd be adjusting the blankets, and William's eyes would track his movement for just a second before going distant again. The memories came unbidden as Thomas worked. Fragments of dreams he'd dismissed as imagination now felt like something else. 2 boys running through tall grass, their laughter identical, a sense of incompleteness he'd carried his entire life, suddenly having context. He remembered his mother's face when he was young, how she sometimes looked at him with an expression he'd interpreted as love, but now recognized as guilt. Late one evening, Thomas put on old country music from the 60s, something his parents used to play on the radio. Patsy Cline's voice filled the room, singing about falling to pieces. William's face crumpled. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks, silent and steady, while his body remained motionless. Thomas moved to the bedside, took his brother's hand, and cried with him. Max lifted his head and released a low, mournful howl that seemed to contain all the grief the room couldn't hold. The bills arrived with ruthless regularity. Medical supplies, nursing consultations, medications not covered by William's minimal insurance. By the end of the first month, Thomas had burned through $8,000. He sold Sarah's jewelry, the pieces she'd left him, that he'd been saving for his son's wives, and got $1,200 from a pawn shop. Margaret discovered the empty jewelry box, and her fury finally found words. "You sold your dead wife's rings for this. I sold my property to care for my brother. Your brother is a ghost, Thomas. He doesn't know you're there. He doesn't know anything. You're destroying our life for someone who can't even thank you for it." "I am not doing it for thanks. Then what guilt penance? This noble suffering routine won't bring back the years he lost." "No," Thomas said quietly, "but it might give meaning to the years I have left." Margaret left the room without responding, but he heard her on the phone an hour later, her voice low and urgent, talking to someone about lawyers and mental competency evaluations. The bank sent a letter in the second month. Mortgage payment missed. Property in danger of foreclosure if arrear is not satisfied within 90 days. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, calculator in hand, doing math that didn't work no matter how many times he tried. His pension covered maybe half of William's care. He had perhaps $8,000 left in savings. The ranch was worth maybe $180,000 in its current condition, but selling would take months. Louise Martinez came by that afternoon with a casserole and questions. She was 68, lived 3 properties over, and had the kind of face that made people tell her things they meant to keep private. Thomas found himself explaining everything: the valise, the brother, the impossible choice between financial ruin and moral bankruptcy. Louise listened, nodded, and organized a community fundraiser without asking permission. She called it Supporting Our Veterans, and told the story of 2 brothers separated by circumstance and reunited too late. In 6 weeks, the campaign raised $2,400 from neighbors who had little themselves. Thomas cried when Louise delivered the check. Not because it was enough, it wasn't, but because, for the first time since Sarah died, he didn't feel completely alone. Brad called on a Sunday evening, his lawyer voice fully engaged. "Dad, I've consulted with some colleagues. We can file for psychological evaluation if you're found to be making decisions against your own interest due to diminished capacity. Michael and I can assume power of attorney." Thomas set down the book he'd been reading to William. "You'd have me declared incompetent to protect money that isn't yours yet, to protect you from yourself. I'm more clear-headed now than I've been in years. Son, maybe that's what frightens you." He hung up before Brad could respond. Margaret had been right about one thing: he was destroying the life he'd built, but that life had been constructed on a foundation of ignorance. and Thomas had lost his taste for comfortable lies. Jessica Hayes arrived at the ranch on a Thursday morning, sent by Louise, who knew someone who knew someone. She was a community legal aid attorney, 42, with gray streaks in her black hair and eyes that had seen enough hardship to recognize it in others. She listened to Thomas's story without interrupting, reviewed William's medical records, and then pulled out a file that changed everything. Your brother had a life insurance policy through the VA, $250,000, designated for next of kin. Thomas stared at her. That's impossible. He had nothing. Veterans of his era were automatically enrolled. The policy's been dormant since he was institutionalized under a false name, but it exists. However, she paused, choosing words carefully. There's a problem. William Walker legally ceased to exist when he became John Miller. To claim the policy, you need to prove biological relationship and have the court recognize his true identity. That means DNA testing, legal filings, potentially months of litigation. How long? 3 to 6 months if we're lucky. Longer if the insurance company fights it. He has less than a year to live. I know. Which is why we need to start immediately. Thomas agreed to everything: blood tests, document searches, court appearances. The DNA results came back definitive 90.9%. Probability of monozygotic twins. But when Jessica filed the claim with Patriot Insurance Company, requesting the death benefit be made available for William's care, the response was swift and devastating. The company's lawyer was named Richard Caldwell, a man in his 50s with silver hair and a voice like brushed steel. He arrived at the ranch unannounced 2 weeks after the filing, carrying a briefcase and an expression of practiced sympathy. Mr. Walker, I understand your situation is emotionally complex, but Patriot has a fiduciary responsibility to its policyholders. According to our records, William Walker was declared missing and presumed deceased in 1980. The file was closed. The policy was nullified. Your records are wrong. He's been alive this entire time. So you claim. However, we have documentation signed by a Dr. Harold Stevens confirming the declaration. Our position is that this John Miller, regardless of DNA, represents an attempt to resurrect a claim on a closed policy for financial gain. Jessica leaned forward. Are you seriously suggesting my client invented a twin brother and planted him in a nursing home decades ago for a long con? Caldwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. I am suggesting that without irrefutable proof that William Walker and John Miller are the same person, proof that supersedes our legally filed documentation, Patriot will defend its position vigorously. We'll see you in court. Ms. Hayes. After he left, Jessica made phone calls. The truth emerged slowly, then all at once. Dr. Harold Stevens, the physician who'd signed William's death declaration, had retired wealthy to Florida in 1987. A little digging revealed a $50,000 deposit to his personal account in 1985, the same year William was declared dead. The insurance company had paid someone to make a veteran disappear on paper, saving themselves a $250,000 liability. They murdered him with paperwork, Thomas said, voice hollow. and they'll fight to keep him dead. This is going to be expensive, Thomas. Court costs, expert witnesses, depositions. I can work pro bono, but the rest you're looking at 20 or 30,000 in expenses. Thomas looked at William, sleeping peacefully with Max curled against his legs. How much do I have in equity? Don't. How much? You are based on the appraisal. Maybe 160,000 after you pay off the mortgage. Sell it. That evening, Margaret found him in the living room, watching William breathe. She'd been distant for weeks, but now her voice carried something harder than anger finality. I've filed for divorce. Thomas nodded slowly. I understand. Do you? I gave you 15 years, Thomas. I stood by when you brought him here, when you sold everything, when you stopped being my husband and became his nurse. But I won't watch you destroy yourself over someone who doesn't know you exist. He's my brother. He's a cause. He's your chance to be the hero you never got to be for Sarah, for your parents, for anyone. But I'm not going to be collateral damage in your redemption story. She paused at the door. I'll be staying with my sister. The lawyer will contact you. After she left, Thomas sat in the silence. Max lifted his head, watching him with those steady brown eyes that seemed to understand everything. Brad called the next morning. I heard about the divorce and the house. You're actually going through with this insanity. Yes. For what? A man who doesn't know his own name? Who won't remember any of this? You're burning everything for nothing. He's not nothing. He's your uncle. He's family. He's a stranger who shares your DNA. That's not family. Dad, family is the people who raised you, who you raised, who actually know you. Michael and I are your family, and you're choosing him over us. I am choosing to do what's right. Right. Right would have been our grandparents keeping him, raising him, not abandoning him, but they made their choice. And now you're making one that punishes everyone who actually stayed. Brad's voice cracked. You're my father, Papa. Doesn't that mean anything? It means everything. Which is why I need you to understand I can't be the man I want you to be if I walk away from this. Then I guess we're done here. The line went dead. Michael called 2 hours later, his voice thick with exhaustion and something that might have been grief. Brad told me, Dad, I can't watch this anymore. I know. I don't think you're crazy. I think you're the sanest person I know, and that's what makes it hurt worse. You're choosing this with clear eyes, and that means you're choosing it over us. Michael, take care of yourself. Dad, I love you. I just can't be part of this. Thomas set down the phone and walked to William's bedside. His brother's eyes were open but unseeing, fixed on some middle distance only he could perceive. Thomas took his hand, papery skin, bones like bird wings beneath, and spoke to the brother who couldn't hear him. I don't know if you understand anything anymore. I don't know if it matters. But they're right about one thing. I am choosing you. Not because you're worth more than them, but because no one else ever did. Our parents chose fear. Our family chose silence. Your country chose to forget you. Someone has to choose differently. Max shifted closer, his body pressed against both brothers, a bridge of warm fur and steady heartbeat connecting two men who'd spent 70 years as strangers. Thomas had lost his wife, his sons, his home, and his future. But sitting there in the converted living room with a dying brother and a loyal dog, he felt more complete than he had in 7 decades. The cost of redemption, he was learning, was everything, and he'd pay it gladly. Max started coughing in the 3rd month of William's homecoming. Small fits at first, easily dismissed as age or allergies. But by the 2nd week, the coughs came with flecks of blood, and the German shepherd, who'd never shown weakness, began moving slowly, carefully, like something inside had broken. The veterinarian was a kind woman named Gretchen, who'd treated Max since Thomas moved to New Mexico. She ran tests, took x-rays, and delivered the diagnosis with the practiced gentleness of someone who'd said these words too many times. It's hemangiosarcoma, cancer of the blood vessels around his heart. It's advanced. Thomas, I'm sorry. How long? Weeks? Maybe a month if we're fortunate. We can try chemotherapy. But at his age, with this type, she paused. The treatment would be harder on him than the disease. My recommendation is palliative care. Keep him comfortable. Let him have whatever time remains with dignity. The chemotherapy would cost $8,000 and buy maybe 2 painful months. Thomas had $4,200 left in his account. The court case ate money like a living thing: filing fees, document retrieval, expert witness consultations. Jessica worked for free, but Justice apparently charged by the hour for everything else. He chose comfort care. $200 for pain medication and anti-nausea pills, enough to see Max through to the end. The veterinarian hugged him when he left, and Thomas wondered how many times she'd watched people choose between love and bankruptcy, between the possible and the practical. Max seemed to understand. He stopped trying to jump onto the bed, content to lie on the floor between Thomas and William's hospital bed. But he refused to leave William's side, except for brief trips outside. And even then he'd whine at the door until Thomas let him back in. Some nights, Thomas would wake to find Max with his head resting on the edge of William's bed, keeping vigil over a man who didn't know he was being guarded. The court case stalled in its 2nd month. Patriot Insurance filed motion after motion, each one designed to delay and exhaust. They demanded additional documentation, questioned the validity of DNA testing, argued that the statute of limitations had expired on claims filed under false pretenses. Judge Morrison, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and no patience for corporate maneuvering, denied most of the motions, but each one cost time Thomas didn't have and money he'd already spent. Boy, the ranch sold faster than expected. A developer bought it for $170,000, planning to subdivide the land into smaller parcels. After paying off the mortgage and the realtor's fee, Thomas cleared $98,000. It sounded like a fortune until he did the math. William's care ran $7,000 a month, legal expenses another $2,000, and the developer wanted possession in 60 days. Louise helped him find a rental house in town, a small 2-bedroom with cracked linoleum and water stains on the ceiling. It cost $1,200 a month and felt like a coffin after the open expanse of the ranch. Margaret's divorce papers arrived the same week they moved, delivered by a courier who apologized for the timing. Max deteriorated rapidly in the new house, as if the move had severed some vital connection to the life he'd known. He stopped eating. The coughing fits came more frequently, leaving him exhausted and trembling. Thomas carried him outside to relieve himself. The dog's weight, shockingly light, all bone and fur and fading spirit, Brad called one final time, his voice devoid of warmth. "I heard you sold the ranch. I hope it was worth it. Dad, I hope when you're old and broke and dying in some state facility, you remember this choice." "I will," Thomas said, "and I'll be proud of it. Then we're done. Don't call me again." The line went dead. Thomas waited for the pain, but felt only a distant ache, like grief for something already mourned. On a Tuesday night in late autumn, Max refused his pain medication. He dragged himself to William's bedside with a determination that broke Thomas's heart, then collapsed beside the hospital bed with a heavy sigh. Thomas lifted him careful of the tumors he could feel beneath the skin and placed him gently on the bed next to William. Max curled against William's side, his graying muzzle resting on the old man's chest. Thomas pulled a chair close and kept watch as the night deepened. "You brought us together," Thomas whispered to the dog. "You dug up the truth when everyone else wanted it buried. You stood guard when no one else would stay. You're the best of us, Mac, the very best." Max's tail thumped once against the blanket. William's hand, which hadn't moved purposefully in months, shifted until his fingers touched Max's fur. The gesture was so slight Thomas almost missed it. Then William's eyes opened, truly opened, focused and present in a way they hadn't been since he'd come home. "Good boy," William whispered, the first words he'd spoken in 4 months. His voice was rusty, barely audible, but unmistakably real. Max's tail thumped again, slower this time. He licked William's hand once, then looked at Thomas with eyes that held something like peace. His breathing slowed, each breath a little shallower than the last. Thomas stroked his head, tears streaming freely down his face. "It's okay, buddy. You can rest now. You did your job. You brought us home." Max exhaled one final time, a long, slow release that seemed to carry all the loyalty and love a dog could hold. His eyes closed. His body went still. William kept his hand on Max's fur, his own tears trailing into his white hair. Thomas held them both, his brother and his dog, the two beings who'd mattered most, and sobbed. The sound filled the small rental house, raw and unashamed, the sound of a man who'd lost everything and found something more valuable in the wreckage. They buried Max the next morning in Louise's backyard under an oak tree that had seen a century of seasons. Thomas carved a marker from scrap wood. "Max, the one who brought us home." William attended in his wheelchair, bundled against the cold, his eyes clear and aware in a way they hadn't been since the war. As they lowered Max into the earth, William reached for Thomas's hand and held it tight. Two brothers, reunited by a dog's instinct and devotion, standing together at last over the grave of their savior. Emily Carter appeared at the rental house 7 days after Max died, arriving in a silver sedan with out-of-state plates. She was 50 years old, with dark hair graying at the temples, and William's eyes set in a face weathered by hard living. Thomas answered the door, still wearing yesterday's clothes, exhausted from a night sitting vigil beside his brother. "Mr. Walker, Thomas Walker?" "Yes. My name is Emily Carter. I think—" She paused, steadying herself. "I think William Walker is my father." Thomas stood frozen, hand still on the doorframe, as Emily explained. She'd grown up in foster care in Colorado, shuffled between homes after her mother's suicide when she was 12. Linda Walker, she'd kept William's name, even though they never married, had left a sealed letter to be given to Emily on her 30th birthday. Inside were the truth and documents a love story cut short by war. A pregnancy Linda had hidden when William returned too broken to be told, and the name of a man Linda had loved until the day she'd swallowed a bottle of pills. "I've known about him for 20 years," Emily said. Sitting at Thomas's kitchen table with coffee neither of them drank, "I've been watching over him, paying what I could toward his care at the nursing home. I worked 3 jobs some years to afford it. I wanted to tell him who I was, but the doctor said it would only confuse him, maybe cause distress. So I stayed silent." "You've been alone with this for 20 years. Not completely alone. I had my husband, my children, but yes, essentially alone. Until I heard about you." She pulled an envelope from her purse. "I've been following the court case. I know about Patriot Insurance, about Dr. Stevens, and the falsified death certificate, and I have something that might help." Inside the envelope were military records. Jessica hadn't been able to locate William's complete service history, commendation letters, medical reports from his return stateside. There were also photographs William in uniform, young and unbroken, smiling beside a German shepherd with alert eyes and a service vest. "That's Duke," Emily said. "My mother told me about him in her letter. He was William's K-9 partner in Vietnam. Duke saved his life twice, once from enemy fire, once from William himself after Duke found him with a gun on a particularly bad night. When William was institutionalized, they put Duke down, military policy at the time. My mother said it destroyed what was left of him." Thomas stared at the photograph, something clicking into place in his mind. "Max, what?" "My dog, the one who found the valise that led me to William. I adopted him from a shelter 10 years ago. The woman running it said he'd been brought in by someone who couldn't keep him, but wanted to ensure he found the right home. She was very specific about that, the right home." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "That was me. Max was Duke's great-great-grandson. I'd been tracking the bloodline for years, waiting for the right time. When I learned you'd bought a ranch not far from where William was living, I thought maybe if you had one of Duke's descendants, something would happen. Some instinct would trigger. I know it sounds crazy." "Crazy would be everything that's happened in the last 4 months. This is just—" Thomas's voice broke. "This is the only thing that makes sense." Max knew. Somehow he knew what he was supposed to find. Emily stayed for 3 hours, filling in gaps Thomas hadn't known existed. She'd been monitoring the situation from a distance, watching Thomas take William in, waiting to see if this stranger would prove himself worthy of the truth. When the court case began, she'd made her decision. "I have money," she said. "Not a fortune, but I've saved carefully. $80,000. It's yours for legal fees, for William's care, for whatever you need. I should have come forward sooner. I was scared, and I'm sorry. Emily, he's my father. You're his brother. We're family. Even if we're strangers, let me help. Please." Thomas called Jessica that evening. With Emily's documents and financial support, the case transformed. They had proof of William's service record, photographs establishing his identity before institutionalization, and most crucially, medical records showing a continuous thread of treatment from military hospital to psychiatric facility to nursing home. The false death certificate began to look like what it was: fraud, not bureaucratic error. Jessica also uncovered something else. Dr. Harold Stevens had performed the same service for Patriot Insurance on at least 6 other occasions, declaring living policyholders dead to void expensive claims. The company had saved millions. Stevens had retired wealthy, and somewhere in Florida, he was living comfortably on money earned by erasing vulnerable veterans from existence. The evidence went to Judge Morrison, who scheduled an emergency hearing. Richard Caldwell arrived with 3 associates, all expensive suits and leather briefcases. Jessica arrived alone, carrying a banker's box of documents and a fury she'd been carefully banking for months. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Caldwell argued procedure, precedent, the sanctity of closed cases. Jessica argued morality, criminality, and the fundamental question of whether an insurance company could profit from making veterans disappear. She presented Dr. Stevens' bank records alongside 6 other cases of fraudulent death certificates, all bearing his signature, all coinciding with large deposits. Judge Morrison listened without expression until both sides rested. Then she removed her glasses and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of absolute authority. "I've been on this bench for 23 years. I've seen insurance companies deny legitimate claims over technicalities and timing. But this," she gestured at the evidence spread before her, "this isn't denial of coverage. This is systematic fraud perpetrated against men who served their country and returned too damaged to defend themselves. Mr. Caldwell, your client will settle this claim immediately for the full policy amount plus interest accrued since the fraudulent death certificate was filed. That comes to $250,000 in base coverage and $83,000 in interest. Additionally, Patriot Insurance will pay Mr. Walker's legal costs in full and will cooperate with any criminal investigation into Dr. Stevens' activities." Caldwell started to object. Morrison's gaze stopped him cold. "If Patriot wishes to appeal, I will personally ensure this case receives media attention. I suspect the public would be very interested to learn how a major insurance company has been stealing from veterans for decades. Do we understand each other?" "Yes, Your Honor." 3 weeks later, the check arrived, $333,000, made out to Thomas Walker as William's legal guardian and next of kin. Thomas stared at it for a long time, thinking about the ranch he'd sold, the marriage that had ended, the sons who no longer called, all of it for William. All of it had seemed impossible just months ago. Now he held possibility in his hands, purchased with everything he had owned, and Thomas paid off every debt within a week. The credit cards maxed for medical supplies, the personal loans from neighbors who'd helped when the money ran dry, the back rent on the cramped rental house. He bought the small ranch property adjacent to Louise's land, 20 acres with a decent house and a barn that needed work but had good bones. It wasn't the spread he'd lost, but it had a view of the mountains and enough space for William to sit outside in the sun. The real money went to William's care. Thomas hired a full-time nurse, a gentleman named Marcus, who'd worked hospice for 15 years and treated his patients like family. They converted the downstairs bedroom into a proper medical suite with equipment that beeped and hummed through the nights. William received medications that actually managed his pain, physical therapy that kept his muscles from atrophying completely, and a level of attention that would have been unthinkable 3 months earlier. The lung cancer was Winnie, everyone knew it. No one said it aloud, but William's final months would be comfortable. That was something. That was everything. Emily visited every weekend, driving 5 hours each way to sit with the father who'd never known she existed. She brought photographs of her children, William's grandchildren, and talked about her life in a gentle monologue that expected no response. Sometimes William's eyes would track her movement across the room. Sometimes his fingers would flex as if reaching for something just out of grasp. But 2 weeks after they moved into the new house, William had what the doctor called a moment of lucidity. These happened sometimes with Alzheimer's patients. Brief windows when the fog cleared and the person they'd been surfaced one last time. Thomas was reading aloud from a Western novel when William's hand gripped his wrist with surprising strength. Thomas looked up to find his brother's eyes focused, aware, devastatingly present. "Tommy," William whispered. The name rusty, but certain. Thomas's throat closed. "I'm here. I waited for you." William's voice cracked with 70 years of absence. I thought you forgot me. I didn't know. I'm so sorry. William, I didn't know you existed until—" He couldn't finish. The enormity of it overwhelmed language. "Not your fault." William's grip tightened. "They chose. They picked you. But you came back for me. You came back." "Of course I came back. You're my brother." William smiled, a real smile that transformed his wasted face into something almost young. Thank you for not giving up." They sat together for an hour, William drifting between clarity and confusion, but always holding Thomas's hand. He asked about Max, and Thomas told him about the burial, about the marker under Louise's oak tree. William cried quietly, then asked if they could visit the grave. Thomas pushed William's wheelchair across Louise's property the next morning, Emily walking beside them. The oak tree was beginning to turn, leaves gold and red against the blue New Mexico sky. The marker Thomas had carved stood weathered but readable. William stared at it for a long time, then reached down as if to touch a dog who was no longer there. "Good boy." "Oh," he whispered. "Good boy. Max." That was William's last clear day. By evening, he'd slipped back into the fog, and this time he didn't emerge. The cancer accelerated its work. To Patel, the hospice physician, gave them days, maybe a week. Michael called on a Tuesday evening. Thomas almost didn't answer, but Emily encouraged him with a look that said, family deserved chances, even when chances seemed pointless. "Dad," Michael's voice was thick with emotion, "I heard about the settlement, about the house. I'm sorry for everything I said, for not being there." "It's all right, son. It's not Brad and I. We were so focused on the money, on what we thought we were losing, we couldn't see what you were trying to save. I'd like to come visit, if that's okay. I'd like to meet my uncle before." He couldn't finish. "I'd like that too." Michael arrived 2 days later with his wife Sarah and their teenage daughter Olivia. They sat with William, who didn't know they were there, but seemed calmer with more people in the room. Michael cried when he saw his father's face thinner now, aged by exhaustion and grief, and apologized again in broken sentences that Thomas waved away. "You're here now. That's what matters." Even Brad called eventually, his voice stiff but present. "I can't come out. I'm not ready for that. But I wanted you to know I don't think you're crazy anymore. I think you're better than I am, and I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything, Brad. Just be who you are." "Who I am isn't very good? Then be better. You've got time." William died on a Sunday morning with Thomas, Emily, and Michael in the room. The end was peaceful, a gradual slowing of breath, until there was simply silence. Marcus checked for a pulse, nodded gently, and stepped back to give them privacy. Thomas held his brother's hand, still warm, and felt something settle in his chest. Not peace exactly. The grief was too raw for that, but rightness. He'd done what needed doing. William had not died alone, unmourned, forgotten. He died as William Theodore Walker, brother and father, known and loved. They buried him next to Max under Louise's oak tree. The funeral was small. Louise and her family, Jessica Hayes, Dr. Patel, Marcus, and a handful of neighbors who'd followed the story. Emily spoke about the father she'd never known, but had loved anyway. Michael read a psalm. Thomas simply stood at the graveside and whispered thank you to a brother who'd given him purpose in the final years of his life. The marker Thomas carved matched Max's William Theodore Walker brother, father, Marine finally home. Thomas used the remaining money to open William's house, a small facility on his property dedicated to housing homeless veterans. It started with 3 beds and Marcus as the primary caregiver. Funded by the insurance settlement and donations from people who'd heard the story, Emily served on the board, Michael helped with legal paperwork, and even Brad sent a check with a note that read simply, "For Uncle William." On the anniversary of William's death, Thomas adopted a German Shepherd puppy from the same shelter where he had found Max. The dog was a grandson of Max's line, all dark fur and alert eyes and immediate devotion. Thomas named him Hope, standing on his porch at sunset, Hope at his feet, and William's house visible across the property. Thomas felt the weight of the past year settle into something bearable. He'd lost a marriage, a ranch, his savings, and his relationship with one son while nearly destroying the other. He'd gained a brother for 4 months, lost him to cancer, and learned that family was both more and less than blood. The ranch wasn't the one he'd owned before. His bank account was modest. William's house needed constant funding and attention, but 3 veterans slept safe tonight who wouldn't have otherwise. Emily called him Uncle Thomas now, and her children had started doing the same. Michael visited monthly. Even Brad had promised to come for Christmas. Thomas wasn't naive enough to call it happy, but sitting there with Hope's warm weight against his leg and Max and William resting together under the oak tree, he called it enough, more than enough, everything. Sometimes the hardest truth we face isn't about what we've lost, but what we never knew we had. Thomas Walker spent 70 years living half a life, unaware that a brother existed just beyond his knowing. When Max dug up that buried valise, he didn't just uncover documents, he unearthed the question we all carry: what would we sacrifice for someone who can't repay us? What defines family when memory fades and recognition dies? Thomas lost everything: his marriage, his home, his son's respect, his financial security. Yet in William's final months, He found something money couldn't buy, the peace of knowing he'd chosen love over comfort, sacrifice over safety, truth over the easy lie of ignorance. Max and William are gone now, but their legacy lives in William's house, where forgotten veterans find shelter. Thomas learned what perhaps we all must, that redemption isn't about erasing the past, but honoring it with present action. That loyalty means staying when leaving makes sense. That family is what we build when we stop protecting ourselves and start protecting each other. Have you ever discovered a truth that changed everything you thought you knew about your family? What would you be willing to give up to, right or wrong, from the past? Share your story in the comments below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.